Hey, it's Matt O'Leary, and it's finally time for New Music Monthly, where I cover a host of new released albums in the worlds of alternative and indie and prog, including my most anticipated albums and even disappointments. We're just gonna cut right to the chase here. First up is a solo album from the drummer of a wildly popular indie alternative rock band, The War on Drugs. Charlie Hall's Invisible Ink is a contemplative instrumental album with glistening guitars and ambient pads, and he's really built his own sound environment with this record. It's very warm at times, but when the ambience and the drum machines kick in, it kind of leans things in a more eerie direction. Like on Crockett's Cove, which has a little bit of a unsettling Twin Peaks kind of energy to it. He follows a similar drum machine first formula on the song First and First, which starts very minimal, very clean, and then grows texturally into probably my favorite song on the album. It just has so much lush layering that I love. There's so many tracks on that DAW, there's so many things layered on top of each other, and he's packaging it up in a way that stays simple, stays elegant. It's kind of like a more successful version of that Mac DeMarco record from early in the year, 5 Easy Hot Dogs, not the super long one that's just demos, but more Heartland elements, the pedal steel is in there, similar to The War on Drugs. Next up is a suggestion from a longtime commenter and subscriber to the channel who goes by Man of Oil. Not sure what your actual name is. You probably shared it at one point, but you should do that because this thing is a premier recommendation. It is really scratching an itch. It's the debut album Snake Sideways from the band Do Nothing from Nottingham, England. This band has been tied mostly to post-punk from what I've seen. And there are some jagged riffs and, vocal affectations that tie it to post-punk, but I think this is more musically interesting, more diverse, and, just varied in its sound than most post-punk I've heard. And it has more in common to me with an indie rock band like Personal Space, if you've heard of them. Very witty, very the general quirkiness of the sound is pretty similar. Neither of those bands fit very well either into any subgenre label. A little like Parquet Courts, but more dense. And I even think of a little older indie rock band, the Temper Trap. The vocalist has a lot in common, and just the general melodicism and the tone of the guitar specifically. I'm loving the variety on this record, the unpredictable instrumental palette, and just really interesting interplay between the harmonic instruments. There's always something interesting going on behind the main melody and chord progression, some odd texture or line that just perks my ear anew with every listen. And I just keep coming back to this thing again and again and again. In a year of many solid debut albums, one of the most anticipated, at least in the prog scene, was this new signing from Inside Out called Ochrist from Norway, spelled AVKRVST, I think, annoyingly. Let's just get it out of the way. Opeth and Porcupine Tree. That's the secret sauce for this band, and they pretty faithfully evoke both of those bands on the first track, The Pale Moon. Treacherous minor riffs, long legato guitar lines over mellotron beds and haunting acoustic guitar. Steven Wilson-esque soft vocal harmonies. Say no more. The trouble I have with this album is it doesn't really occupy its own emotional space within me, so I don't find myself like, oh, I have to listen to the approbation. It's the exact aesthetic and vibe of music that I like, so every time I'm listening to it, I'm like, yes, I love this is perfect, but I never really crave it in the same way that I do Pale Communion or Ghost Reveries or Hand Cannot Erase or like Deadwing. And there are some moments like the title track that feel like a cheap emulation of Porcupine Tree. You know, it's that industrial metal sound on that song and that kind of dude rock riffs. The vocals certainly don't have as much character as either of those bands. Yet, it's hard not to get behind this band. You know, the recording, the production is so pristine, so well done. The whole album really has a powerful and gorgeous sound. And they have the foundation laid here to spread their creative wings on a second album and really come into their own. Speaking of progressive rock, the next band is dismissed, I'd say, by certain people at least, but I assure you, if you're a fan of progressive rock, you really owe it to yourself to do some digging into the back catalog, the later albums especially, of the Dave Matthews Band. Because Away from the World and Grugux King especially have some amazing prog. I stand by him 100%. I don't want to portray this band as underdogs, you know, because every album they put out sells like hundreds of thousands, and not to mention their concert tickets, which who knows, you know, probably 20, 30 million sold at this point. But I do think they're dismissed by the prog community, at least. And this new album, Walk by the Moon, has some really great stuff. A couple tracks I really love. And then some really decent material as well. One of the true bangers is the song The Only Place, with just a killer groove and soaring chorus, plus a dueling guitar and Moog's synth solo at the end that's just so chaotic and perfect. You know, they just go back and forth and it's not too long. It's just the perfect little moment. Then it's back to the chorus, which is euphoric. I can't say that enough. I expect every DMB album to have some cringy ballads and, just some histrionics and street preaching from Dave. But, I take what I can get, and if you're willing to dig a little bit deeper, you will discover some excellent tracks. It Could Happen and Monsters are also worth checking out, and just really great production and playing with these guys every time. Next up is the fifth album from an English singer-songwriter who had 2 mini strokes in 2022. He was just sitting in the garden, listening to the radio, which you'll hear referenced right away in the first song. Lover of song, dancer of twine. Yeah, it's Ben Howard with Is It? This whole experience just filled Ben with a sense of urgency and really cut down on his typical 3 to 4 year timeline for an album. He's definitely shifted away from that pure indie folk sound of the debut album, which is the one that put him on the map, but to be honest, I'm not that into it. He shifted into this much more spacious folktronica kind of sound when he got to Noonday Dream in 2018, which is my favorite of the bunch. Is It is probably his most experimental album, but still very pretty and characteristically lush and accessible. Days of Lantana has all sorts of production flourishes with pitch-shifted lower harmonies and tons of samples. But at its core is a lovely ballad, and it's simple and repetitive enough structurally to warrant all this production flair. The song Moonraker is pretty similar. The producer here also worked with the experimental pop artist Westerman, which, when you hear this, it totally makes sense. At times I feel like the production overshadows the writing. The vocals and the melodies can be very minimal. A song like Interim of Sense comes to mind. But overall, this is a pretty fun listen. A little bit like Noonday Dream, it rewards repeat listening and really getting into his state of mind, reading about the album, trying to understand his intentions. There's a lot on this pretty short, pretty digestible record. There's standard indie rock, and there's 80s drum machines, and there's, of course, a lot of guitar and piano as well. There's even a song like Total Eclipse with this indecipherable spoken word, these sentence fragments that mirror how Ben lost his speaking faculties after the stroke. The first and the only time that I've seen this next artist was also the time when I met Adrienne Lenker, so it's pretty cool. And they weren't playing together. This guy was unbelievable live, and of course I'm talking about the legendary guitarist Pat Metheny, who has 1 million albums at this point, and his 1,000,001 album is DreamBox, which is one of his softest and dreamiest yet. And I gotta be honest and say that Pat's music is something I've always appreciated more than I've loved. I have a few favorites from him, but it's mostly Pat Metheny Group albums from the 70s and 80s, albums like Off Ramp or American Garage or First Circle or the self-titled album, really the beginning set of albums. But I always love the feeling I get from Pat's music, and really DreamBox is exactly the same way. You know, it's really the premier work from home on your computer album. It's very characteristically meditative, and melodies just wind into oblivion. You know, it just sounds like Pat's having a great time. And Pat had this to say about the album, thought it was pretty interesting. Music exists for me in an elusive state, often at its best when discovered apart from any particular intention. I hope folks might find some dreams of their own in this music. Hell yeah, Pat. Next up is a French band that's pretty new to me. They play this very interesting mix of prog and post-rock and jazz and electronic. It's been the future with Sounds So Wrong, and the first half of this album is much more active and much more in your face. You know, it's got these rampant sax and synth solos on the opener Desert Eagle, led by some very hyperactive drumming, and the kit sounds so sharp. You know, it has this crack to it, especially the snare drum, that really makes it stand out in the mix from the rest of the crowd. The second track, J'aime la Mature, has this gorgeous arpeggiating synth texture, and it's more of a straight groove kind of track with this sweeping end section with strings and brass. I love the guitar melody on the song Somewhere Beneath, which floats over top of this brooding rhythm guitar driven groove. But the end of the album is the part that really works for me, with much softer and almost astral textures, with more synth arpeggiation on the song Those Small Things, which, you know, when mixed with that string sound, those two together, just, it's a beautiful sound. This is really a unique blend of sounds from a very young band. You know, I'm excited to see where they go. I'm excited to explore their first album. I kind of hope they find a really great vocalist, but if they stick to this kind of spacious, ethereal jazz kind of thing, then I'm okay. All right, we got a final album on the list today. This is another progressive rock band that I wasn't very familiar with until last year's album, Ancient Astronauts. It's the Norwegian band Motorpsycho. I just love the direction they've taken on this new album, Yay, which is really like what Motorpsycho would play around the campfire, especially on tracks like Cold and Bored or Dank State, which have a real lightness of spirit. WCA, or What Comes After, is also a little bit like that. You know, it reminds me a lot of my favorite Scandinavian psychedelic rock band, Dungen. Lots of acoustic guitar, and very similar to the last album I talked about, these very kind of sleepy, almost elegiac chord sequences. Very haunting and dreamy, but also pleasant and lighthearted, like I said. Hotel de Dallas is an anomaly here at almost 8 minutes, with its very cinematic string stabs and very long, drawn-out solo sections. You know, this is the prog journey kind of track, and I love it. Overall, just a really well-done album in just about every way. And you know, after listening to Ancient Astronauts and not being too familiar with the band's other work, this was a surprise. I didn't think they had this in them. So I'd like to see them kind of take it further and continue with this and not have it just be a little one-off fun thing. But yeah, just really cool stuff. I've listened to it a lot too, and that's it. Those are my favorite albums of the last month. Let me know if I missed anything, what you thought of these albums. Of course, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And as always, thank you so much for watching.